My sibling Jolly and I lived close to an elementary school where we would often go to walk our dog in the playing field and nearby woods, or we'd let our dog roam while we played on the playground or made pretend in the woods. I think I was around 14 when this happened, about 10 years ago. The schoolyard had a playing field, a playground near the building, and another playground farther away in a crop of trees. We were swinging on the swing set at this more distant playground, but from this play area, you could clearly see residential streets and the school parking lot, which wrapped around the crop of forest. As we were swinging, I saw an SUV drive up one of the roads and pull into the parking lot. It was a weekend, so there were no other cars around, and very few people, maybe the occasional passerby walking their dog through the school grounds. The SUV was about 40 meters, approximately 130 feet from us, and I wear glasses, so I couldn't see very well what the people looked like as they exited the car, but I could see distinct clothing pieces. There were 3 people, 2 older individuals who looked to be in their 50s, and 1 younger person, possibly in his 20s. One of the older people was wearing a wide-brimmed women's sun hat, and the younger man was dressed in a green and white striped jersey and cleats. It wasn't unusual for people to come to the school to use the field for play or practice, though looking back, it was odd they parked in the lot rather than on the side of the road closer to the field. At the time, I thought, okay, just some grandparents and their grandson going to practice in the field, and continued playing with Jolly. I remember watching the trio walk away around the school building, completely opposite from where we were. After a while, we decided to stop swinging and take the dog for a walk through the trails in the woods. Maybe 20 minutes had passed since the car had arrived. The brush we were walking in was in the very corner of the school property. There was a metal chain link fence in front of us, and beyond it was the sidewalk and a residential road. To our right was another fence that separated the school grounds from people's backyards. These homes had tall trees growing along the school fence, giving them privacy, so it was almost impossible for anyone to see into the schoolyard. Jolly and I were at that awkward age where playing pretend no longer felt as genuine or spontaneous as it used to, but we still tried. I was bored, but didn't want to go home yet, so I picked a branch of red berries growing in the schoolyard and said to Jolly, "Hey, want to play a game?" Which was our code for "let's play pretend," and I bent down to offer the berries to our dog as the starting point for the game. They'd never heard her. I was still talking to Jolly, who was walking in front of me, when I noticed my dog's behavior. She completely ignored the berries and me and began moving past me slowly, ears back and nose pointed, as if she were approaching something. I followed her movements, still looking down. When I finally looked up, there were the 3 people from the SUV, not 2 meters, 6 feet in front of me. They definitely weren't a couple of grandparents and a kid, but rather 3 grown men. I remember the faces of the 2 older men pretending to be grandparents. One had short white hair and a scruffy white beard, his mouth slightly open as he breathed quietly, focused on keeping his steps light. The other man was extremely thin, with pronounced cheekbones and greasy shoulder-length brown hair. They had silently crept up behind us and remained just as quiet, turning their backs and pretending to point off into the trees like they were bird-watching. It was eerie how silent the whole encounter was. I immediately realized We needed to get out of there. I quickly hooked my dog back onto her leash and told Jolly over and over that we needed to leave, but Jolly was still caught up in the imaginary game we had been playing. Finally, Jolly saw the men. I never looked back at them. I just focused on my sibling. Jolly stopped talking and started walking with me. Luckily, there was an opening in the fence between the woods and the road just a few meters ahead, and we managed to put some distance between us and those men. To my frustration, Jolly wanted to stop and pick more berries through the fence, but I frantically urged them to keep going. I never looked back, my eyes fixed on the safety of the open roads, sidewalks, and houses ahead of us. We made it home without any apparent incident. Had the men followed us on foot? Had they gone back to their car to follow us? Or had they just given up? I didn't care. I just wanted to get home, which was only a couple of blocks away. When we got home, I broke down and told my mom what had happened. I remember her reaction being somewhat dismissive. I had always been an anxious child, and she had developed a habit of downplaying things, maybe as a kind of exposure therapy. But her reaction didn't make me feel safe, so I retreated to the basement and cried alone. When we talked about the incident years later, she told me she did call the police, but nothing ever came of it. I'm incredibly thankful for my dog because I believe she saved both me and Jolly that day. In the years since, I've developed a strong skill for reading people's body language. I can tell when someone is lying, read emotions and intentions like a book, and sense when something feels off from a distance. It's both a blessing and a curse. This happened back when I was still living at my parents' house. I was commuting to college and had 3 siblings at home, my brother and 2 sisters. We lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded by woods and farm fields. Since my dad normally left for work at 2 a.m. during the week, I always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house, especially during the times when you'd imagine something sketchy happening. However, because it was the weekend, my dad was home that night. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. Our rooms were upstairs, and when you stepped out of either room, you could look down over the banister and see the front door. It took me a few moments to fully wake up and grasp what was happening. I checked the clock. It was around 2:30 a.m. My brother whispered to me that there were 2 men at the front door. That really woke me up. We quietly stepped out of my room and peeked over the banister, but by then, no one was at the door. I saw my parents standing off to the side, out of view of the door's glass panel. I whispered down to my dad, and he told me 2 guys had been knocking and talking to each other outside the door. Hearing this freaked me out even more. I quickly grabbed my pistol and crept down the stairs, making sure the men weren't at the door, as they would have easily spotted me coming down. My brother followed close behind as we joined our parents. We whispered to find out what was going on. My parents had woken up to the sound of our dog barking and saw the 2 men knocking loudly at the door. Despite no one answering the door and the dog still barking, the men returned and continued knocking. Given that our house was isolated, with the nearest neighbors hundreds of yards away, their persistence at 2:30 a.m., despite the barking dog, made the situation even scarier. After a couple of minutes, the men walked away. We all moved to the family room to peek out the windows. The driveway was lit up by our outside light, and there was a black Cadillac parked there, but no one was inside. The big question? Where did the men go? We soon found out when the handles on our back French doors started jiggling. They were trying to enter the house through the back kitchen doors. At this point, my mom frantically called out, "David!" to my dad, pure terror in her voice. Two things happened. I was filled with adrenaline as I prepared my handgun, horrified by the thought that I might have to use it, and my dad calmly called the police, explaining what was happening. After a minute of jiggling the back door handles, the men stopped and disappeared again, only to return to the front and start knocking again. By then, several minutes had passed. Suddenly, we saw local police cruisers fly up the driveway with their lights flashing. As they pulled in, the two men bolted, trying to run around the house. One of them disappeared from view, but the other was intercepted by an officer yelling at him to get on the ground. He refused and was immediately tased, dropping to the ground. Some officers chased after the second man, while one of them came to talk to my dad and me as we stepped outside. They eventually found the second guy hiding in my sister's little playhouse in the backyard. Both men were clearly drunk or high, and the one hiding had cocaine on him. While they were arrested that night, we never found out what they were charged with or what happened to them. Needless to say, it was an experience I won't soon forget. Back when I lived in a quiet, rural town in Canada, my friends and I often found ourselves bored with little to do. Our town had a number of abandoned buildings, left vacant as residents moved away, and we turned exploring these places into a form of entertainment. Before the experience I'm about to share, we'd never encountered anything too strange during our explorations. Sure, we'd come across the occasional creepy sight, like mysterious stains or odd symbols, but nothing that genuinely scared us, until one particular night. We decided to check out an old building that used to be a combination daycare and mental hospital. It had been shut down for years due to a lack of patients and children, and we thought it would be fun to explore its decaying halls. I was 15 at the time, and so were most of my friends. The night we chose couldn't have been more stereotypical for something creepy. Fog blanketed the ground. It was getting dark, and a light drizzle fell as we approached the main gate. The gate was padlocked, but we weren't about to let that stop us, so we helped each other hop over it, making way more noise than we should have. We were laughing, unaware of what was waiting for us inside. We started in the daycare section, our flashlights illuminating old toys, broken furniture, and crayon drawings that had long since faded. It wasn't long before the usual banter and giggles faded, replaced by silence. The further we went, the more tense we became. I was picking up an old container of crayons when we heard a loud crash coming from a metal door leading to the psychiatric ward. We froze. My friend Brian, always the bold one, suggested we check it out. While I wasn't keen on the idea, there was no way anyone was going to back down in front of the group. We forced the rusted door open with some effort, revealing a narrow hallway lined with metal doors. The smell of rust and decay grew stronger as we walked deeper into the ward. our flashlights barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. At one point, Brian stopped dead in his tracks, shining his light into a room. He thought he saw someone standing there, but after a moment, he shrugged it off, and we continued. Looking back, I think he really did see something. The atmosphere grew heavier as we ventured further in, and then one of our friends told us to stop. We all stood still, listening. Faint footsteps echoed down the hall ahead of us. Fear settled in. We exchanged nervous glances, but Brian, as always, pushed ahead. We didn't want to leave him alone, so we reluctantly followed. Then we entered a room that reeked of rotting meat. In the middle of the room was a dead deer, its insides spilled across the floor. One of my friends, unable to handle the sight or the smell, threw up on the spot. That's when we heard the whispering. Brian shone his flashlight into a corner, revealing a man standing there. His head was down, and he was muttering to himself. His clothes were torn and stained with what looked like blood, and his feet were bare, filthy, and bleeding. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, frozen, staring at him. Finally, he looked up, grinning at us with a crazed expression. "You guys here for the feast?" he asked, his voice fluctuating wildly. That was all we needed to hear. We ran. We sprinted back toward the daycare section, desperately trying to slam the heavy door shut behind us. It took 3 of us pulling with all our strength to finally close it. Just before it shut, I could see the silhouette of the man standing there, his grin still visible in the dim light. As we caught our breath, sitting behind the door, the reality of what had just happened hit us. We were still trying to make sense of it when we heard a faint tapping on the other side of the door. That was the final straw. We bolted out of the building and didn't stop running until we were far away. A year later, police found the man. He had been a patient at the psych ward before it closed down and had escaped from the facility he was transferred to. He had been living off the wildlife around the complex and was suffering from several diseases as a result of eating raw meat. Rumors surfaced later that he might have even killed someone, though nothing was ever confirmed. In the end, the experience taught me one thing: exploring abandoned buildings might seem exciting, but you never know what or who you might encounter. Always be careful and trust your instincts. If something feels off, leave. You never know how real the danger might be.